In a perfect square trinomial, we need to first make sure that we are given a trinomial, so it has to have 3 terms. Then we're looking for the first term to be a perfect square, the last term to be a perfect square, and then those square root values multiplied by 2 needs to give us the middle term. So, for instance, if we had x squared plus 6x plus 9, well, x squared is a perfect square, and 9 is a perfect square. So, we're good so far. Then, if we take the square root of x squared, we get x, and the square root of 9, we get 3. So, using this middle term here, 2 times x times 3 gives us 6x, which is what we have. So we know that we have a perfect square trinomial. So how does this factor? Well, you take the rooted values, so the square root, and you form one factor. And it's the same factor written twice. So x plus 3 and x plus 3. So this works because if we were to FOIL, we would have x squared, 3x, 3x, and 3 times 3, which is 9. So notice how this middle term can simplify into that 6x, which we started with. So that makes sense because we just added the same thing twice, which is why we have a 2 up here, because it's 2 times a times b. So that's why we have the same thing twice. So that's how we factor it. It's the same factor written twice. So you could even go one step further and say, well, if I get to this part, x plus 3 times x plus 3, I could also write it like this. Right? Because it's the same 2 things multiplied by each other, which gives us x plus 3 squared. Okay, let's look at another example. So again, we have the formula. We have a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. So this is what we're looking for. So number 2, x squared minus 2x plus 1. X squared and 1 are perfect squares. This is a trinomial. So the square root of x squared is x. The square root of 1 is 1. So then you need to ask yourself, okay, well, if I take 1 times x, I get 1x, and I double it, I do get 2x, but I don't get negative. So this is what we need to think about now. If we get that 2x there, now we just have to play around with the signs. So I'm going to have x and 1 and x and 1. But I'm actually going to have a minus in both of them because they need to add to give me a negative, but then multiply by each other to get a positive. And when we FOIL, we get x squared, we get negative 1x or negative x, and another 1, and negative 1 times negative 1 gives you the positive 1. So when we double check, we get what we started with. So again, we could write it in a different form and also say x minus 1 squared. Okay, so now if we took this one step further and solved for this, going back to this form right here, x minus 1 and x minus 1 equals 0. So let me ask you, what minus 1 gives you 0? Well, 1. And if we do it again, what minus 1 gives me 0? Well, I'm going to get the same number. Those 2 factors are the same. So this is my final answer. You could also just write x equals 1 because it's a little redundant. However, when I go to graph this, that means I have a 0 at positive 1 right here. And it opens up because it started as a was a positive number. So it's actually going to look like this, where it doesn't go through twice. It bounces at the 1 spot. So at x is 1, it hits and goes back up. So remember when we talked about quadratics and say we could have two solutions, no solutions, and one solution? This right here is an example of when we have one solution. And again, you can write 1, 1, or you can just simply write x equals 1 as your final answer as a 0. Okay, let's try a more difficult problem. Okay, so let's try 4x squared plus 20x plus 25. 4x squared is a perfect square, and 25 is a perfect square. So that means, in my little formula, in this a squared plus 2ab plus b squared formula, if I take the square root of 4x squared, I get 2x. This is kind of like that a value. Then for b, if I take the square root of 25, I get 5. Well, 2 times 5 is 10. Multiply it by 2, I get 20. So this works. This is a perfect square trinomial. So my final answer is going to be 2x plus 5 and 2x plus 5. So now let's solve. Well, solve this, set this equal to 0. You subtract 5. You divide by 2. Well, since this is the same exact factor as the one I just solved for, this is my one single answer. So now if we were to graph, we change this into 2.5, negative 2.5. So on my negative side, here's my 0. And it opened up, and that's my quadratic. So I'm going to give you one to practice on your own, and then bring it to class tomorrow. So here you go. Try this one. Remember, check to see if you have a perfect square trinomial first, and then factor and solve from there.